Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for We Were There. It's my pleasure to direct this. This series was created so that the original investigators can share their stories and insights and inspire us to continue their work. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ann Schuckett, Principal Deputy Director of CDC.
Well, thanks so much, Phoebe, and welcome everybody to our We Were There session. In the midst of the 2019 Ebola outbreak, today's We Were There presentation takes us back to our very first experience with the deadly virus in a remote part of the DRC, then known as Zaire. Today's Ebola outbreak occurs in the midst of multiple other challenging CDC responses. The opioid overdose epidemic, the effort to end HIV transmission in America, investigations into severe lung injury occurring in association with vaping. And in 1976, the deadly Ebola outbreak was relegated to the back pages of U.S. newspapers, because that February, a cluster of severe respiratory illness in soldiers in Fort Dix seemed to herald a new flu pandemic, with echoes of 1918. In July of 1976, just a month before the first reports of Ebola in Yambuku, it seemed the pandemic had arrived as dozens of men and women who attended the American Legion Convention in Philadelphia developed severe pneumonia. By August, shortly before the WHO reported a second Ebola outbreak in Sudan, hundreds of Legionnaires fell ill and many died. Influenza was ruled out quickly, but it would take until Christmas for CDC to discover the bacterial cause of that outbreak. When we faced the unprecedented urban Ebola epidemic in West Africa in 2014, and authorities raced to develop a vaccine against the virus, a leader from Sierra Leone wondered how serious this race could be if this virus had been known for 40 years. Today, we'll hear about that initial sprint to understand and stop a deadly Ebola outbreak. Today, we know that Ebola is not the only challenge the Congolese are battling, nor the only public health response that CDC is tackling. Some of the roots of today's outbreak were also at play back in 1976. And in hearing from those who were there, as well as those who've been returning to DRC since then, I hope we'll discover some insights to the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schuckett. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Dr. James Lang, Dr. Joel Bremen, and Dr. Jonathan Towner. If you'll please come to the stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Welcome all. I will relate to you a little bit of experience that I had through my involvement in the initial discovery of what came to be known as the Ebola virus, although we didn't learn that right away, that it took some time. But the primary theme of this is that we were there, and so I will try to show you where there was and what the basis is for saying that we have had 50 years of high containment laboratories on this campus. I tried to find pictures of this first facility that was put into operation in 1969. The best I could do is a schematic. It consisted of a trailer. I've heard two descriptions of it, one being similar to an Airstream trailer and another being the trailer that you see on the highways in the tractor-trailer tandem. Which one is correct, I do not know, but this gives you a little bit of the layout where people entered, exited, and showered out of this facility. The reason it was placed here was because of the initial discovery of a virus called Marburg virus, which involved outbreaks in 3 different European cities, one of which was Marburg, Germany. And that's where the namesake wound up in the literature and approved by all the nomenclature committees. So this 1969 facility is the basis for our saying we've had containment facilities on this campus for 50 years. The second iteration of a high containment lab was when I first arrived, called Building 5A, then 7A, and finally, after another nomenclature scramble, Building 8. And that's what we call it to this day, Building 8. It consisted of 2 levels. The red level that you see contained an inner laboratory. The biocontainment concepts were being applied even then, a box in a box in a box. This outer shell was simply to protect the inner shell from the elements because it didn't function as a barrier per se, but the inner hallways and then the room itself that were contained therein were negatively pressurized so that nothing in the air moved away or outside the facility. It was commissioned in 1972. I want to give you an idea of what it was like to work in. It was strictly a Class 3 glove box line consisting of stainless steel and plexiglass under very high negative pressure. I forgot to point out that the brick portion of this contained the support systems for the upper level laboratory, and the most important part of which was an incinerator that incinerated all of the exhaust air out of the glove boxes to a temperature of 1,500 degrees. This is where anyone who worked in the lab started their day, through this double door autoclave. A confounding and limiting factor working in such facilities is that you have to plan down to almost the minutest detail so that you bring in all of your materials that you'll be needing on that given work day through this double door autoclave. Once you place it in from the outside and close the door, that outer door can't open until this one is open and then run so that you can safely open the outer door. That's at the end of the workday when you shove all the contaminated materials back in it so that you can start the process over. This is a photograph of typical workstations. It doesn't show the stools we used to sit on. Working in them was cumbersome, but not totally uncomfortable. The gloves themselves consisted of neoprene 32-inch long lengths of either 30 thousandths of an inch or 15 thousandths of an inch. The 30 thousandths were at the transfer point so that when you were handling potentially sharper or edgy materials that you would be safe handling those. And of course, when you worked in the lab, you worked in a laboratory supplied gown or jumpsuit along with a pair of gloves inside these neoprene gloves. But these function quite well. We could do almost anything other than molecular ultracentrifugation. You know, we had standard incubators, standard laboratory centrifuges, microscopes, refrigerators, freezers, and they all did the job for us over the years that we operated this facility. Up at the top, you can see magna helix that were telling us what level the negative pressure was inside each and every cabinet. And they did vary from one to another, depending on the type of work. The animal quarters were the ones that had the strongest negative pressure. I've labeled these to show that we had both a standard light microscope on the side that this picture shows you, as well as incubator cabinets. We had separate incubators so that we could vary temperatures depending upon our needs. On the other side of this microscope cabinet, we installed a fluorescence microscope after I arrived, so that gave us a little bit better capability. I do want to highlight the fact that this facility, when it was commissioned, was largely the responsibility of the Office of Biosafety and the Division of Virology. This is a photograph of Dr. Robert Huffaker. He's a veterinarian who was the boss of biosafety. He not only put it in motion, but he helped us keep it in motion. He gave us excellent support, assigned one of his permanent personnel to us to work strictly with us and to take care of any needs that we have. And anytime you have mechanical things such as centrifuges, refrigerators, freezers, you have breakdowns, and we had lots of good support anytime we needed it, thanks to Bob Huffaker. This is a picture of Bill Gary. Dr. Bill Gary was the in charge person of laboratory operations when I arrived in 1974. He did my left seat, right seat briefing to take me through all the functional systems, to tell me how things were supposed to work, and to explain to me how to make sure we operated things safely. One of the ironies that when we first started is everything that we did, no matter whether it was from a lab operation standpoint or just a logistical standpoint, was not in writing. So we had to start from scratch and put all of this into a written form and produce an operations manual for this particular lab. And the person who I worked most closely with on that is Lee Alderman. He was invited here, but could not make it today. And he was an Office of Biosafety employee. But I show you this in particular to highlight the fact that the room itself had an autoclave. And this little box here was an ultraviolet light box that we would pass things in and out of the lab if we happened to forget something that could be used outside. And it is the UV box that I pass through a centrifuge tube with a suspension of virus-infected cells suspended in paraformaldehyde that I handed to Fred Murphy on the other side. And this is the squawk box. This is a little communications device that you press to talk and you release to listen. And on the day that we did the work, that's what we used to communicate what was known at that given time. This is not an ideal slide, but it shows what tissue culture cells are supposed to look like when nothing's happening to them, nothing is going wrong. It's a confluent monolayer of fibroblasts that are slightly out of focus. I apologize for that. But I want to show you that in 1976, when the initial Ebola response began, my branch chief, Carl Johnson, went to head up the International Commission in Zaire. And my immediate supervisor, Patricia Webb, who I'll describe in detail in a minute, took out the shipment that we had received, and there were sister shipments sent to laboratories in England, in France, and in Belgium. So 4 facilities received specimens. I assumed that they were split among the 4 of us. We looked through the manifest, we looked at the specimen, we made sure what they said was there, and then we began the task of deciding which one we would pick to inoculate into a confluent monolayer of African green monkey kidney cells, which I did myself. 48 hours later, well, 24, I checked them, they looked okay. 48 hours later, they looked sick. What do sick cells look like? They start looking pycnotic, they disperse, they form giant cells. They don't look the same as that previous slide. They're not healthy. So at 48 hours, I was jumping on my high horse and asking Patricia if I could go ahead and do the harvest. And Patricia said, no, let's wait 24 hours. So she being the boss, I said, aye, aye. Next, waited another 24 hours, did the harvest, went through a whole series of standard protocol measures, saving lots of stuff back in the freezer, passing some to another passage of virocells, and most importantly, from our perspective, making slides of that material that you put into what we call Teflon-coated slide that had punch holes in them that served as literally a well that would hold liquid in them. place those on there, dry them, fix them, and you can do lots of things with that after you have them. Made a box of slides like that. Now, when I did that, while they were drying, and we talked about what else we were going to do. First thing we did was take a preparation of that suspension that I explained that I passed through the glove box to Fred Murphy. And less than 30 minutes after that, Fred was on that little squawk box saying, "It's loaded with Marburg." So when we heard Fred say that, that got us very excited. We thought we had solved the riddle. We were the first ones to discover the causative agent of the outbreak in northern Zaire. Patricia wasn't a high five or anything like that, so we just had a mutually comfortable and giddy feeling about it. So once we knew what we had, I took one of those slides and then went into the freezer and pulled out some of the reference antisera against Marburg that the previous 2 years I had been working on building up a stockpile of. And I did what's called an indirect immunofluorescence test on a slide, along with controls, of course. And after the proper procedure, took a look under the fluorescence microscope on the other side of the cabinet I showed you, and didn't see anything. It was negative. And so I looked at Patricia and said, "Oh no, am I so stupid I can't do a simple IFA test?" So the two of us, in shoulder to shoulder, did another IFA test on a replicate slide. And it turned out to be negative. And we said, "Oh man, what have we got going on here? It looks like Marburg, but antigenically it's not." So that's when we were put onto the right pathway. Once Fred said Marburg, we looked for Marburg, confirmed not Marburg. And I'll give you an idea of what that process looked like. Now, this is the one that Fred published and is seen thousands of times over the years. But what he described to us on his screen on the electron microscope was literally a bird's nest of filoviruses, not this particular one. He said there was virus in between cells, attached to cells, everywhere, once we got to talk to him afterward. And interestingly, 35 years later, I rode an elevator with David Sensor and introduced myself and said, "You were my first boss, and I worked for Fred Murphy when I started, then Carl Johnson." He said, "Yeah, I remember. Fred ran into my office telling me they had Marburg virus going on in northern Zaire." So I said, "Yep, we heard it before you, though." Now, this is what a slide should look like if there's nothing going on immunologically, that is, no fluorescence. Whoops. And I juxtapose one here to show you the green lights that are fluorescent, that indicate there's an antigen-antibody reaction along with a reaction with the tag of FITC, fluorescein isothiocyanate, that is used to detect what reacts with a given antibody or antigen. I do want to make sure I recognize Dr. Webb. She was a very good mentor. She took excellent care of those of us who worked for her. If you worked as in her supervisory chain, she could make life miserable for you because she was constantly asking and trying to get more resources for our group and fighting the bureaucrats too. She was a good bureaucratic infighter. She's interesting. She's British to the core. Her father sent her here during the Blitz in 1941 when she was a teenager. She wound up at Agnes Scott College at age 16, graduating in 3.5 years. Was the only female in her medical class at Tulane Medical School. And she explained to me that many of the male counterparts let her know that she was stealing a seat from a fully qualified male. But if you knew Patricia, she gave as good as she got. But she's a terrific supervisor to work for, and I do want to highlight the fact. And the other thing I want to bring up that's not known to other than very few of us is that after this initial discovery, Patricia worried about my welfare and decided that she would do all of the remaining work herself. But she was too chicken to tell me, which if you knew her, you would understand. So she got Bill Fagey to tell me, which is hilarious when you think about it. And we both laughed about this years later. But Patricia then went back to the original manifest and looked at the very limited clinical information that was available. And I did participate in that because it was non-infectious work. And we found one serum from a patient that had survived, my memory says, to day 11, in the hopes that IgM antibodies would have started showing up. And so she did the subsequent tests using a drib of that patient's serum that she squeezed out of a blood clot, of course mechanically, not with her fingers, and it lit up those slides that I had made. And so that's when we had immunologic confirmation that we had a new agent that looked like Marburg but wasn't Marburg. And then my recollection is that Carl used a CIA map. We used to have a whole library of CIA books on countries, and some of them came with good maps, and he pulled out a map trying to pick out a location that would not be associated with either Zaire or that part of the country, and found a very small tributary of the Congo River called the Ebola River. And that's how my understanding is the virus got its name. Whoops. The next iteration of high containment laboratory came as Building 9. It was purchased from the National Cancer Institute, came down in modules. Contractors through CDC constructed again the outer shell, which is the metal upper part, and then the red brick lower supporting part. This particular laboratory came to us as what was called a virus tissue processing lab. It consisted of a glove box line and offices. And all that you see around the glove box cabinet line rectangular laboratory was retrofitted over a excruciatingly long 3-year period by engineering services here at CDC and some contractors into a suit laboratory. And of course, when it came in 75, Carl Johnson asked, how soon can we have it? And I had no idea. He wanted it next week. As the years went on, it drove him to distraction. But we finally put it into operation in 78, and it operated quite well, having been completely retrofitted from office space to suit lab space, which is quite remarkable in and of itself. Now, everyone has seen these. This is where we stored our suits. The chemical shower was just to the left of here. Each person, of course, had their own suits. We were a small group. There were only 9 of us in the branch. And that ended my association with that. I went on to do other things after 14 years in biosafety. And toward the end of my career, I was given the opportunity to deploy to West Africa to participate in the 2014 Liberia outbreak in support of an epi team in Bong County, and then 2015 and 16, working for Jane Seward in the immunogenicity sub-study of the Ebola vaccine trial. And this is the facility we worked at upstairs where another lab was retrofitted to suit our needs. And that is it. I always pay honor to my spouse of 50 years now and our first grandchild.
So an EIS officer is in an autopsy room in Detroit during the 1976 swine flu campaign that Ann introduced us to see whether the patient, the person who died, had swine flu or had a complication following swine flu vaccination. So he walks out of the room and says, "There's a phone call from Atlanta for you." And Lyle Conrad's on the end of the line, who is chief of field services, and said, "Joel, I was that EIS officer. There's a terrible epidemic going on in northwest, at that time, Zaire. Um, and we don't know what's going on." Calls come in to the embassy and then to CDC, and the government has asked CDC to participate. And I said, "Wait a minute, what's going on?" He said, "Well, we know very little information. Only 100% of the villages are infected. 100% of the people in the villages are sick, and all those people have died." He said, "Do you want to go for just a few days?" That's how CDC operates, for those of you who don't know, just a few days to find out. And I said, "Well, I've lived in Africa." He said, "We know you've lived in, that's why we're calling you. You speak French, and we'd like you to go with someone from the laboratory. And by the way, there's a concurrent epidemic in South Sudan. We don't know what's going on." So a glutton for adventure. I go home, talk with my wife and two small kids. They couldn't talk much then. But my wife said, "I know you're a glutton for and like adventure." And I said, "Also, I have never been to Zaire." So anyway, I call all around to find out what could be going on. And they said, "Well, you're going," first of all, they said, "You're going with Pat Webb from the laboratory, who you had been introduced to." So I had 2 or 3 conversations with Pat. And then I called all around, a number of people saying what could be going on in Africa at that time. CDC didn't know much about Africa at that time in the 70s, other than those of us who had worked on smallpox eradication. And so they said, "Well, the visas have come through. You're ready to roll." And just before I left, I get a call from one Carl Johnson, who I had never met. And we met at JFK in New York. He said, "I'm going because Dr. Sensor has concluded this is so hot and growing," because messages had come in, "and there's a great amount of disorder in the capital of Kinshasa that we want to send the chief of the lab to go with you." So Carl at JFK shows me this virus, which you've seen, very important photomicrograph that Fred Murphy had taken. And I said, "Well, nothing kills 100%. Maybe rabies, but, not so many people as have been reported. But even there had been one survivor from rabies." So anyway, we're on the airplane with 17 packages, and we arrive in Kinshasa, picked up by the U.S. Embassy, and immediately taken to FOMETRO, which is the Belgian Center for Medical Activities. They had been there over 100 years in the former Congo. And sitting around the table were people from a variety of countries and from WHO. And we were told the city is in turmoil because now 2 nuns had come in to Kinshasa from the epidemic area. Both of them had died, and a Zairian nurse who had taken care of one of the nuns herself is sick and in the hospital. And the Minister of Health, Dr. Ngwete Kinkela, says, speaking around to the table, the airplane is ready to take the team out to the epidemic area and to tell us more about what's going on. So Carl, who still doesn't speak any French, but was following this, I'm translating as best I can. I said, Carl, these people are really organized here. A team is going out. We're going to learn, go to the hospital, see the patient. Everyone's looking at Carl and me. We were the people to go out to the field. And by the way, leave your 17 cartons of scientific equipment here. So simultaneously, Carl and I say, no way. We've got to find out what's going on. The embassy, ours and others are hollering. And then the minister says, something has to be done. Now, on that airplane coming into Kinshasa from actually Geneva was one Bill Close. Anyone hear of Bill Close? No Bill Close? Several people. Bill Close had come to Zaire in 1961. Anyway, and ultimately became President Mobutu's personal physician, ran the Mamiemo Hospital, had been a mentor to Dr. Kinkela, the Minister of Health. And Bill, on the airplane, sat with us and said, I will help during the event. He was now director of the largest hospital at that time in Africa. So we said, we met the right guy, and that was prescient. Anyway, the minister said, you got to do something. The next day, I'm on an airplane with Pierre Sirot from France, Peter Piat, first mission to Africa from Belgium, André Cotte from Zaire, and Jean-François Rupaul from Belgium, who ran this mission, the Belgian mission, with 400 Belgian doctors around the country. Jean-François had been born there, spoke the languages. He was on the airplane with us, and here we are. In flying over the Congo River, going within 24 hours, I'm now on an airplane going off to the area. What were we supposed to do there? We were just supposed to, again, go for just a few days to find out actually how far this epidemic, whatever it was comprised of in signs and symptoms, how far it had spread out from this rural mission hospital, to find out if there were active cases, 3, if there were people who recovered, and 4, to find out if we could equip this rural mission hospital of 120 beds with adequate facilities to bring forward a treatment team, a surveillance and epidemiology team, a laboratory team to find out what's going on out there. And so then the airplane was supposed to come back and pick us up. So having had some exposure to epidemiology and CDC, everyone said, yeah, that's good. Now what do we do? Well, I said, well, we go, finally they're talking to me. They had known I had worked on smallpox and had some experience with field experience. And Carl quickly became the scientific director because he was renowned for discovering Venezuelan and Bolivian, Argentinian hemorrhagic fevers. And so he quickly became our scientific director. Now, here we are coming into the Bomba zone. The villages are spread along these tropical roads. Navigation is not easy. And there is the mission, empty, barren, because everyone in that hospital, if they were still alive, had run away. 17 staff at the hospital, of those 13 had gotten the illness and 11 had died. And obviously it was hospital centered because several of the patients who were there for other things now started getting this, what they called a hemorrhagic syndrome. There were 3 nuns and 1 priest left there but 5 of the religious order had died. And they had a picture. The nuns showed us this picture on the right. Here are 4 sisters and a father who had died of this disease, 2 of them in Kinshasa, having been evacuated, and then 1 father there. And there are their graves in the lower left. So Sister Marcella, in front of all the beds, because they didn't know what it was, they exterminated the empty hospital, brought out all the mattresses to burn, and they were very glum. So our initial plan, designed on the run, was for each 4 teams of us, as I described, to go north, south, east, and west, with a sister who spoke Lingala and some Budza with us. And so for 3 days in a driving rain, under the conditions that you've seen, went from village to village. And I was struck early on in talking to some folks who said some well people had come to the hospital or come from a village and received an injection. And the injection was for whatever it was, aches and pains, particularly prenatal care. And then a week later, this syndrome had begun and they died. Well, that was unusual. I said, well, tell me about the needles and syringes. They said, well, in a 120-bed hospital, several hundred people a day, we have 5 needles and syringes used in the outpatient, glass and metal. And, we just kept using the same one for each patient. And I said, well, sterilization? They said, well, we have soapy water in the pan at night. It's unbelievable. So this, the hair on the back of my neck raised. And then when we started going to the villages, the nuns had gone giving prenatal care out to the villages in the same story. They got an injection with calcium, vitamins, antibiotics in those days, and even now, injections are favored. So this is the second day I was out in the field, and here is a patient, first patient with Ebola. So, we had to find what a probable case was, what a possible case was, and of course a confirmed case would be one with immunofluorescent antibodies, because that was all that equipment was with us. So this 25-year-old gentleman was complaining of belly pain, pharyngitis, he had conjunctivitis, and he had some bleeding from his rectum and around his gums. But and abdominal pain was very severe. So I talked to him, and of course but after a while we were carrying with us paracetamol, Tylenol, chloroquine and quinine, tetracycline, things that could cause this fever, headache, and unusual syndrome. There is pure sirop in the personal protection equipment of the time, paper, mask, and gloves, but oppressively hot and humid. Very hard even to wear this stuff. And so this gentleman died the next day. Now, they knew about smallpox and about isolating sick people. And several of the people who had, several of the villages isolated the patients in that way. Quarantinable disease was not unknown here. So we moved on, and then we went back to Bomba, where we were to give our report. We did an inventory. The plane didn't come. 2 or 3 days. So by that time, Joe McCormick had flown in from Sierra Leone to help with the epidemic, and he got through. Joe knew his way around Africa. And another mission came to us. We were at the Catholic mission waiting for the plane. And we say, we're from the mission. We said, well, we're at the mission. They said, we're at the Protestant mission. Protestant and Catholic missions weren't in good communication. And he said, what's going on? So we gave him our preliminary information. And at that time the plane came, everyone had, a lot of people had run away because they were frightened. And the pilots had run away. President Mobutu had sent his family with a couple of planes to Europe. So it was tough to get an airplane and pilots. Finally, the plane came after about almost a week, and the pilot said, "Do not come anywhere near the cabin, sit in the back." And then we went back with our information. Now, when we came back, we were loaded with sandfly bites and a rash on our sleeves, on our arms, and elsewhere. And of course, there was black humor all the time, leavened by Primus, the medicine, the beer of the place. And if you look carefully, there's a bottle or two of Jack Daniels that we always had to have. And so here is Marguerite Isaacson from South Africa, who had experienced treating Marburg in 1975. She came with 2 units of convalescent Marburg serum, and that didn't work on Nurse Mayenga in the hospital. And there is Bill Close, director of the hospital, and so he is now part of the team. And there's a thermometer in my mouth, not a cigarette, and Bill is a chain smoker. But anyway, the guidance that each person on the team, and you'll hear more about that, take their temperature twice a day, and if they're sick, tell the chief of their team. Well, what were the teams? We quickly formed into clinical team, logistics, and equipment. That was Bill, board certified Harvard, Columbia trained surgeon, who said, "I'll do the logistics communication." Jean-Francois Roupol was the chief of the Belgian medical mission, said, "I will do communications," because every embassy, every business, every society person was clamoring. Do we leave Kinshasa? Some did or not. Jean-Francois handled that. Guido Vandergrun handled the immunofluorescent that Pat Webb and team were now sending in antigen-fixed slides, and we did those right out in the field. Could we go back? We told the sisters, because over so many years, that mission had been there since 35. And people had gone out there and never come back often, in the case in rural health facilities, missions, and the rest. We said, we will be back in 10 days. I said, I'll be back. And I told the minister I was going back because we needed to do surveillance far and wide. And the other team, the scientific backup team, also had to come out to do the things I mentioned. And no one wanted to go, except a few others. But Dr. Ngwete ordered now some great clinicians from the hospital. We got the smallpox, the monkeypox, the vaccination, the public health. A few people came out to do mainly the surveillance work because we had to now go to many villages. So here's Dr. Mbui, an immunologist in training, and Nurse Sukato, who had recovered, and his serum had come. And that's one of the ones that Pat Webb had, that his serum cross-reacted with the new virus and didn't react with Marburg, which the CDC hot lab had archived from not only from 75 in South Africa, but from 67 in Yugoslavia and Germany. And so Sukato was a convalescent. And here we are going from village to village, one of our 6 surveillance teams going over these 10 routes that I showed you before, and asking people with our paper forms, village form, individual patient form, epidemiologic forms, history, signs, symptoms. And this gentleman has a shaved head. That was a sign, is a sign, will be a sign of mourning in these villages so we could identify people who had recently had a death in the family. And they were very, very cooperative during our visits. So after we were there from mid-October to the end of January. Now our whole team wasn't there. The major part of our team left in December, but then David Heyman came and continued the plasmapheresis program. We'll talk more about that. And the Sudan team couldn't get in there because civil war was going on in the south. It was a WHO mission, and Don Francis from CDC was part of that team. But when they finally got in, they did some case counting, and it was curious. It was a different syndrome. It was about 50% case fatality rate, a lot of pulmonary signs and symptoms, and then it turned out the virus is a different strain. So here is our epidemic curve. I don't know if I've got here we go. Is this on it? So you see the green here are those that had received the injection at the hospital. And early in the epidemic, the majority of patients had received, that was it, feeling well, or had come in for malaria, fever dropped, and then they developed this terrible syndrome. A lot of them with severe bleeding, but classic systemic signs and symptoms. And then as we went on, it was person to person, mainly in the villages. Of course, we came in now in October, but we didn't know that. You know that when you come into an epidemic, you think you're here, but you want to come in when you're here at the end of the epidemic. Also, try and do that. It's safer. But we didn't know where we were. So that's why we were now moving through and gathering information, really, and sharing it as we got it. So let's move here to the incubation period. And again, the villagers were very cooperative in saying, yes, the woman or man got their injection on such and such a date, and then, or they had contact with the patient that you described. And so the mean incubation period we found was 6.3 days or so. And for person to person was over 9 days. However, we used the first contact with the patient. They could have gotten the infection at a later date and had a shorter incubation period, similar to that of injection. So this is important. Note that the last incubation period we calculated we're told, was 21 days. That's still used today, isn't it? Incubation, 21. Lifting quarantine, 42, 3 periods. This hasn't changed, guys. So this information is still used. Now, okay, you can see better over there. Symptoms, I'm still using my clinical background. Symptoms, what you feel, signs are what you see. So what I described with that patient is clear. Fever, headache, sore throat, all classic. A few had, now the nuns had this rash that I mentioned. So on black folks, you sort of morbilliform rash you can't see. But the signs were as I described with vomiting and diarrhea. Diarrhea, very important because we're looking. And then bleeding, oral lesions, and of course, many of them had a lot of other things. Now, epidemiology. I was told every village had cases, every case died. That wasn't the case. We went around to 550 villages several times over this several month period. And we found that a third of the villages only had one case, and over 90% had less than 20 cases, and only 2 had more than 30 patients. So it wasn't so explosive in the way that we were told. Next, age and sex. Well, females here were over 60, were close to 60%, and newborns died if the woman, pregnant woman, picked up the disease. So, but particularly in the young childbearing age, they were heavily infected. Why is that? Of course, young women of any age, are caregiving. Now, risk factors. So we spent a fair amount of time trying to find out. And these are very tight communities socially. In the family, everyone's involved with touching, caring, sleeping in the same room, preparing the cadaver, attending the funeral. You could say even those in the village who weren't in the family, everyone was at the funeral. And aiding in the delivery, that was very high risk there. But the other factors, and there are many more risk factors that we have listed, animal, food, and the rest, nothing spun up. So this is maybe the most important epidemiologic slide I consider from this first outbreak. And that is the term that I've used a lot. The secondary attack rate can be used for R0, your basic reproduction. But Ebola is not a highly transmissible disease. I will stamp my foot from our first outbreak on that if you're an injection, we spent quite a bit of time trying to find out how many contacts there were for these patients. And the attack rate for injection was less than 10%, and that the few transmission chains that we tracked down before the epidemic withered was overall 5.6. But each generation, the secondary attack rate was very low, except if you delivered as a midwife or were the caregiving spouse, you had a much higher chance of getting the disease. Now, here's one of our volunteers, Del Khan, a Peace Corps volunteer, a laboratory technician, who was collecting blood. On the right, Denis Courtois and Marguerite Isaacson doing plasmapheresis from Nurse Sukato. Don't do this at home or in the field. Wear gloves. Of course, we didn't know everything there is to know, because you can get fever and chills and headache when you're working in these conditions. And Del Khan did. That may have been the saddest day for many of us out in the field when Del got sick. We gave him a unit of convalescent, and we did have a plan for evacuation, A and B. Of course, we didn't know exactly how that plan would work, but Del got into a transport isolator in the back of a Land Rover, evacuated to Kinshasa and then to Johannesburg. He did not have anything that they could find. Certainly didn't have Ebola at Marburg. We never did find out. But for those of you who have been in the field, you know, or even here in the U.S., there are 3 or 4% of children will have fever in a community all the time. Out in the tropics, it's maybe 8 or 10%. Fevers are out there, mainly arboviruses. Who knows? So where did this begin, this outbreak? Well, my hypothesis was that it came from the Sudan. We'll talk more about that. But we looked through the outpatient and the inpatient register. Here's a page from an inpatient register at the hospital. All of the outpatient records, thousands of it, had been burned or thrown away. But here in the inpatient, we looked through for the past year, is a patient, Makilo Aleta from Yondongi, who had nosebleed and diarrhea and fever, who came in at the end of August. And we went to the village, found out, tried to find where that contacts of that patient, and we couldn't go any further back. We had some other history of people moving around, but no village reported earlier epidemic. Now, Joe McCormick, we airlifted Joe to northeast Zaire to find out if there were outbreaks occurring along the frontier between, and that was the hypothesis, that there would be smoldering disease connecting. Joe found nothing. He actually penetrated into Nzara and Maridi. Nzara, in particular, was there before the WHO team. And Joe came back. It was very tough, but he could find no connection. So that hypothesis, even before we knew Sudan was a separate outbreak, was very helpful to us. And Simon van Nieuwenhof went on the northeast border with actually South Sudan, but also down into Kivu, Ituri, names familiar to you all. So here are the major findings, what I've talked about from the first outbreak, summarizing the manifestations, the incubation. Clinically, we collected over 200 units of serum. On the epidemiology, we defined the geographic extent, having covered these 550 villages. We found 55 of which were infected. We defined at that person's at risk, the mode of transmission, transmissibility. A couple of teams that had been there before we had recommended that the Commissar de Zone, the county chief, put the area in quarantine. This was very helpful. They were isolating patients. They also had rapid burial, which we reinforced. And with the medicines, we would rule out other diseases if anyone had this fever. In the laboratory, we did basic tests. Right there in the hospital, we did IFA. And one patient, we did serial viral culture, Nurse Mayenga. Max Germain from France collected mosquitoes, a few rodents. We didn't turn anything up then. So in 76, we left not knowing anything about the animal transmission to humans. We had no treatments, although we had some plasma, no vaccine. We didn't know the extent, even within DR Congo or elsewhere. Although we were getting now calls from all over the country, and Peter Piot and others would go out, carbon monoxide poisoning, a bleeding ulcer, sleeping sickness, so many things that people in the malaria in these villages. So here a slide, one of the slides of our team out there, and I want to show you, you haven't seen Dr. Johnson yet, maybe you saw him in the laboratory, but he sends his greetings. I just talked to him 2 days ago, couldn't travel. But I do want to show you Dr. Miatudila here, who was a clinician, a microbiologist, who was part of our team taking care of patients at the hospital that we immediately tried to open because we needed confidence in our team and in the hospital to take care of, and someone to take care of malaria, diarrhea, the usual things that folks in these rural communities suffer, including obstructed labor. That was important. One of our doctors had done on a door out in the opening, a fracture of a symphysis pubis to deliver a new baby from a woman who was in dire condition. The names are down below. Young Peter Piot above me. So what are the lessons here? You've seen scientific. Each person had a task and a group of people under her or him to work, clearly defined during this several-month period. on the equally important, at times more important, the what I call delivery component of science, of public health programs. We had leadership, we had organization, the communications, transparency, partnerships. All of the groups that were at the original table contributed: coordination, supplies, transport, selective quarantine, isolation, and then we took care of the people, the few survivors, because we wanted them to cooperate for plasmapheresis, but also to learn more from them. Now, here is Johnson with not a CIA map, but with a map used for human monkeypox, which was also in that area. And when we went through Geneva on our way to Zaire, we stopped by the smallpox office on the weekend. Asawa Rita, D.A. Henderson were there and gave us this map, which we use. And here's Carl looking at the circuit that Joe McCormick used. And then one day when things were calmer, we took an excursion on the Ebola River. It was really sort of an effluent of the Congo. And here it is. Now, so I'm going to summarize all this with a slide I've used before relating emotion and activity. So there was terror in everywhere. People didn't know. There was fear, there was confusion, leaving the country, what should I do, to inactivity. And there were many people who left, chaos, running around without focus, and local investigations. There had been some people who had gone up there and collected specimens, particularly the local doctor who was honest in saying, we had all these signs and symptoms, and I don't know what it is. Another person went up and said it's typhoid and brought typhoid vaccine, started giving shots in the usual way. So these local vaccinations, even before we arrived, and the specimens collected and sent to identify were key. So we didn't have much information. And as time went on, there was even more uncertainty, anger of all the deaths, sorrow, shock. Then isolation, quarantine, the virus was identified, our international commission was formed, and by that time, anxiety was being modified with understanding, trust, focus, and then we did the rapid and then the more detailed investigations, and confidence was being developed, partnerships and trust. And, our band of brothers and sisters was really forming. And at the end, we had huge celebration because there hadn't been cases now for a couple of months. And it continued afterwards, and the epidemic was over. Now, in 1996, NIH and Antwerp, Institute of Tropical Medicine, had a conference in Antwerp because 1995 we had Kikwit, second big outbreak in DR Congo, huge. And a year after that outbreak, we had a symposium. Some of you were there. And now Dr. Mayembe, who worked with us initially, came, and he is, again, another one of the heroes, and he is leading the Congolese effort today. And I do want to show at that ceremony Pat, who is already getting sick, Pat Webb, who is the discoverer of Ebola virus. I'll define that as the person who sees something new and knows that it's new. Everyone else saw what they called Marburg virus and called it Marburg virus. But Pat knew something new by the indirect fluorescent test. And here's Peter. So let me dedicate this part of the talk to all of those who participated. First and foremost are the people who suffered up in northwest Equateur province, and then the 6 countries who are our collaborators, including the World Health Organization. So thank you all very much. This is dedicated to over 100 people.
Okay. So, for the record, in 1976, I was not there. I was 10 years old and trying to figure out what I was going to do as I was starting fifth grade. So I think my job is to bring you up to present day. And a lot has changed from 1976. One you can see from this slide here, it's showing Ebola outbreaks that Ebola has reemerged in different forms quite a number of times since 1976. And I say that because if you look at here, the current nomenclature, I mean, there's a lot more known species of Ebola. In 1976, we knew about Marburg virus, as we just heard, Ebola in Sudan, although we didn't know there were two different viruses at that time. But since then, we've just discovered Raven virus, Reston virus of hot zone fame in '89, which Tom Kizak and Pierre Roland were quite heavily involved in and at RID at the time. Typhorus virus, Bundibugyo virus, the newest Ebola known to be pathogenic in humans. And just last year, Bomba virus, which was found in bats, for which there hasn't been any known association with human disease. So I came to the branch, special pathogens branch, in 1997 to develop a genetic system for studying Ebola virus to try and pick apart genetic determinants of virulence, inspired by the finding a couple of years before by Karl Klaus Konzelman, where we're finally, after many years of looking or of trying to develop a genetic system for a negative strand RNA virus, he was successful with rabies. So I toiled with that for a couple of years, and then in 2000, it was one of those instances where your life is taking a left turn, but you don't know it yet. And the Ebola emerged in Gulu in northern Uganda, and overall the outbreak was large, 425 cases. That up until the 2014 outbreak was the largest Ebola outbreak on record. Of course, this was Ebola Sudan. I went there with 5 other folks, with Tony Sanchez, Pierre Roland, who's here in the audience, Scott Dowell, Scott Harper, and Dan Bausch. And I'm not going to tell you I'm a lab guy, so I can give you this from the laboratory perspective. And so one of the main things we wanted to do was to set up diagnostics right there at the site of the outbreak. And we knew from previous work that the serology, the antigen capture assay that Tom Kizak had developed, as well as M and G assays were fieldable, but we weren't sure about PCR. And so, as the molecular dude, that was my job to set up the PCR-based diagnostics. And of course, at that time, there wasn't real-time PCR. This was submarine gels and sort of old-school PCR. So we set up shop in the diagnostic or in the laboratory wing of St. Mary's Lachore Hospital in Gulu. As you can see in the circle there in the red, we picked out a room that had a good open window, and there was a sort of a non-functioning biosafety cabinet. The light went on, but I don't think there's all that much airflow. So, and you see in the upper part there, there's Pierre and Tony would do do all the hot lab work, doing antigen capture, IgG and IgM, handling all the material. And they would pass it out to me. I'd stick the samples in TriPure, which worked great for all of you on the LSRB board. TriPure works just fine. And do the PCR across the hall to do the RNA extraction. And then at the top part, see if we get this thing to go here. Up here, we would do the product analysis. This is submarine gels. We want to keep this stuff as separate as possible. And all told, we tested over 1,000 specimens. We were the first of 3 teams to show up. And in the subsequent study of the specimens, once the outbreak was over, one of the things we learned, and the reason why I'm mentioning this now is because it's pertinent to how we're evaluating some of the therapeutics for the ongoing outbreak, and that is that the fatal cases would have much higher viral loads than non-fatal cases, and this is evident very early on, in the orders of 2 or more logs higher in fatal versus non-fatal cases. So moving on, a couple of years later, Marburg virus emerged in Angola, and this was in 2005, 252 cases and a 90% case fatality. And this emerged in Uige, northern part of Angola. And so the difference here in terms of fielding diagnostic assays was that in addition to the ELISA-based methods, now real-time PCR was in vogue, and we had developed high throughput platforms for real-time PCR. A lot of that actually was developed as a result of the anthrax outbreaks, where we needed to develop high throughput capacity for select agents. And so this we set up in the bottom floor of the Public Health Institute there in Luanda, Angola. I should mention that Health Canada at the time also was doing some diagnostic work in Uige in the northern part. And so we set up in the bottom floor at what was then the Global AIDS Program diagnostic lab that was run by Amilcar Tanuri. And so in that space, there was a functioning biosafety cabinet, which we then piped out the window to generate some negative airflow. And somewhere along the lines, I guess someone realized that the INSP wasn't paying their electrical bill, so they cut the cord, so we had no power. And fortunately, Tom Kizak got on the phone because Chevron, Shell, BP all have a financial stake in Angola because there's lots of oil there. So Chevron produced a 100 kVA diesel generator and 2,000 liters of diesel fuel within about 24 hours. So we are eternally grateful to them. So in the end, I think we tested a little over 500 samples of various sorts. And as I said, this was the first time we sort of set up sort of a higher throughput real-time PCR. And also it was the first widespread use of oral swabs as a diagnostic specimen. This comes with some limitations. Obviously, a lot less things you can do with oral swabs, but this is when it started. Moving forward into there are a couple of years of what we call banner years of filovirus activity. Starting in 2007 with Marburg virus emerged in a small mine in western Uganda, a small outbreak too, only 3 cases. And the small size of that allowed us to engage in an ecological investigation, which proved to be very fruitful, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And then a couple of months later, a second miner went in surreptitiously and got infected with Raven virus, so the other Marburg virus. And about the same time, in Luebo, in the middle of DRC, Ebola had emerged. And this is a fairly large outbreak, a little over 264 cases. And the branch CDC effort, led by Tom Kizak, there on the motorbike, assisted by Stuart Nickel, riding on the back of the motorbike. There's no helmet laws. And so they led the CDC effort there in Luebo. And as we're always in a situation where we're trying to improve upon the situation, there was a fan that was set up in the window to try and create some rudimentary negative airflow where the hot samples were run. And then at the end of the year, another Ebola virus outbreak emerged, and this was a brand new species of Ebola that we then later named Bundibugyo virus. And this was the newest to date species of human pathogenic Ebola virus discovered. And it's also notable because it was the first time the NGS, or next generation sequencing, which is very commonplace now, then it was 454, not Illumina based, was used to characterize a new filovirus. 2008, didn't get much of a break. In July, Marburg reemerged in a nearby place called Python Cave, not too far from Kataka, which I just talked about previously. And in fact, there were two cases independent. One was the first one was from a woman from the Netherlands. The second one was a woman from Colorado that actually had been infected 6 months prior. And then it was later on that year we discovered, along with our colleagues at USDA in Plum Island, that swine would serve as a very good host for Reston Ebola virus. And so, that went on. To date, there's still no known pathogenicity in humans with Reston. Interestingly, in 2014, at the time that many of us in this room were buried in the West Africa outbreak, there is a report in Archives of Virology that the Chinese had detected Reston virus circulation in pigs in 2011 in Shanghai, China. They were screening those pigs for PRRS virus, or porcine reproductive respiratory virus, which actually was how the samples ended up at USDA in the first place. So I guess if you go to Shanghai next, beware of the pig meat. And then Ebola reemerged in Luebo again about a year later. So they were a couple of years off. And then in 2012, we had another banner year where Ebola Sudan, this time in Jabali, in sort of the middle, sort of northern part of Uganda, emerged. It was a small case. We were able to do some ecological studies. Ebola Bundibugyo emerged for the second time, this time in northeastern DRC, actually about 200 miles north of where the current outbreak is now. And so this was the Bundibugyo variety. You can see Christina there being taught by Brian Bird how to fuel a generator. And then to cap it off, Marburg emerged in Abanda, which is the town that services the Kataka mine that had appeared 7 years prior. And then Ebola Sudan reemerged in Luero again. And so a lot of activity going on. And what you may have noticed, at least in those Uganda episodes, that the overall number of cases was quite small. And this is not by accident. It was in large part due to the fact that starting in 2010, our branch had invested majorly in establishing a VHF surveillance program at Uganda Virus Research Institute in Entebbe, there in Uganda, not far from the Red Star there in Kampala. And as evidence of its effectiveness, you can see in this slide here on the left, sort of outside of the shading area, shows a couple of outbreaks where you can see in the blue are the number of probable and confirmed cases are quite large, and on the bottom part of in the pink is the time it takes to detect that outbreak. And you can see that once the VHF surveillance got established, both of those become much smaller. And again, proof in the pudding that if you put in the effort here, as we did and have maintained, is very effective at being able to detect these outbreaks quite quickly, which obviously minimizes the public health impact. So moving on to West Africa, and obviously this changed everything, at least from the diagnostic challenges in response. It was a major effort. I think as most of us in the room here are aware that it started, at least it was first detected, came to our consciousness in March of 2014, but we think it probably started back in December of 2013. And from the lab standpoint, this turned into a United Nations of labs. In the end, over, 27 different field labs were established and operated all over West Africa. These labs were provided by multiple countries besides the United States. The U.S. agencies that involved, besides CDC, included National Institutes of Health and USAMRIID. So for the CDC lab, we operated two labs. One was at Elwa in Liberia. We helped run that along with the NIH guys at Rocky Mountain Labs. But probably most of the effort was devoted to the Bo lab in the central part of Sierra Leone. And you can see in the center there, our hot lab was about as rudimentary as you could ask for. It was 4 posts and a tarp and a corrugated roof and natural ventilation. But it proved to be very effective. And the PPE, or the protection, we just used Pappers, and it worked quite well. It had a very high throughput. And this lab was embedded into the MSF ETU there in Bo. This is a shot from the helicopter. And so how we set this up, so I showed you the hot lab, and the rest of the laboratory for the RNA extraction and the PCR part and all the paperwork and specimen accessioning, that was all done in a nearby 2-bedroom house that we essentially repurposed the bedrooms and the main living area. So the clean room was a bedroom. There you can see some of the before and the after. You have your unmade bed, and then on the right turned into the clean area. And then the other bedroom, you see the bed there on the left, and this turned into the RNA extraction room. And this is a slide showing that at least in the middle part, at least through January of 2015, the Bo lab tested over 7,000 cases. And so relative to the contribution of the other labs, it was quite significant. So there were a lot of samples that went through this lab. This is one of my favorite slides. So the specimens came in multiple types. There's lots of confusion and so lots of different ideas about how to send a specimen. Some of them came in a plastic jar. Some of them came in a coffee urn, plastic bottles. Getting the paperwork there in the upper right was always a challenge because sometimes there was a little bit of a reddish smear and you weren't quite sure what that was. So we always disinfected the paperwork that came with it. Some things came in falcon tubes, and some tubes were shoved in gloves or other bags of various sorts. Sample transport was a challenge and had to be scaled up dramatically. They came on motorbikes, ambulances, and at one point we had a helicopter circuit running by Unmir of either the old Russian Ilyushin helicopters or these Bell helicopters. So in the end, the accomplishments of the Bo lab were over 27,000 samples tested. The lab remained operational for over 400 days without a day off. And the agency can be pretty proud of itself. In the end, there were 28 teams of personnel pulled from 17 different branches that were all trained in special pathogens and were deployed in series to operate the Bo lab. So it was a major agency effort. So I thought I'd have a next kind of series of slides here just in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of HCL activity here. So we just learned about the Ebola Zaire in 76, and shown here is a picture of Carl Johnson working here at CDC. And this is kind of from the midpoint on, starting in 1993 with the identification and isolation of Sinombre virus, which is the Four Corners virus, is a hantavirus. Caused a lot of panic at that period. Since then, many hantaviruses have since been discovered, and Stuart Nickel was in the lead with that one. Nipah virus, which was it's a bat-borne paramyxovirus that emerged in pigs. We now know it comes from bats, and if that sounds a little bit familiar, that's because this sort of scenario was the inspiration for the movie Contagion. SARS virus was identified here with in VSPB and also with IDPB. And I should say with many of these virus discoveries, the infectious disease pathology branch was working hand in hand with VSPB in terms of identifying many of these agents. Bundibugyo Ebola virus that we already mentioned. Lujo virus, first discovered as a South African arenavirus that killed 4 out of 5 people that were infected. In 2012, Heartland virus. Now you see quite a few cases of that every year. Some of them are fatal. Susuga virus is a bat-borne paramyxovirus discovered in 2014. I'm sensing to move forward. All right.
We have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Great. All right. So vaccines. You want me to finish or no?
Sure.
All right. The first vaccine established was operated in Building 15. This is now the J&J vaccine the current vaccine going on is being used. It's looking quite promising. Over 200,000 doses given, 97% efficacy. There's a couple of therapeutics that are looking promising. They're both monoclonal antibody based. And a few slides about where does Ebola come from. So bringing you fully up to date. And there are a couple of bats. That's the prevailing theory. We don't, at this point, still don't know what the reservoir is. A couple of bats tested positive, but we still, that data hasn't been reproduced since then in 2005. However, there was a story, at least the Zaire or the outbreak in West Africa started in Guinea at this tree that a 2-year-old kid played in. Mops condylurus bats inhabited that tree. They all tested negative. However, that's the same species that turns out looks like it hosts Bomba virus, a finding that's been confirmed in Kenya and also nearby Guinea. And then I'll just finish with saying, however, we do know a lot about Marburg virus, which is the close sister to Ebola, where we've identified the Egyptian rosette bat as the natural reservoir for Marburg virus. And this was started with studies carried out by Bob Swanepoel in Bomba mine in eastern DRC, and then followed up and first isolated by us here in Building 15 in 2007. And this is a discovery that we've now confirmed again in Sierra Leone. So it turns out you can find Rosetta bats in Sierra Leone. They too carry Marburg virus. So in 2 minutes, I'll stop there and say that there's a lot of lessons learned that we can apply to Ebola. And we're working on it now. I mean, it's going to be a long effort. One of the main lessons is just that the percentage of animals that are actively infected is low, which means that if you combine that with the fact that there's over 250 different bat species throughout Africa, that's a lot of bats that need to be tested if, in fact, bats are the reservoir for Ebola virus. And so I think with that, I'm going to stop. I sense Phoebe next to me, and we can move into the questions.
Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. And I would like to again thank the speakers for their excellent presentations. It is 2:00, and I'm sorry that we do not have time for question and answer now, but you are free to stay in the room for a few minutes and come up and talk to the speakers. And then there is something again at 3 if you want to talk. There's room outside too. Thank you again so much for joining us. Appreciate it.